a man would write a poetical love letter to the lady of his choice, which she must answer amiably, even should she have no mind to him. If, however, she were happily inclined, he would visit her secretly at night and leave before daybreak. Would he now? Welcome or welcome back to her murmuring library. Today I am so excited to start The Diaries of Court Ladies of Old Japan, a collection of 3 extraordinary women's diaries from Heian era Japan. We'll be reading Lady Sarashina, Murasaki Shikibu, and Izumi Shikibu, 3 women whose lives, intellect, and influence give us this rare, intimate glimpse into a world of art, poetry, politics, and power. Delightfully, this collection starts with a bit of historical context so we can vividly see exactly what it meant to be a powerful woman in Heian Japan. Unfortunately, Amy Lowell's introduction was written in the 1920s with the kind of colonial racism that lends it an obnoxious air of superiority. So, I will be editing it as we go to preserve the context with less of the bias. Let's jump right in, shall we? Amy Lowell's introduction. The Japanese have a convenient method of calling their historical periods by the names of the places which were the seats of government while they lasted. The first of these epochs of real importance is the Nara period, which began AD 710 and endured until 794. Previous to the Nara period, the Japanese had been semi-nomadic. As each successive Mikado came to the throne, he built himself a new palace and founded a new capital. There had been more than 60 capitals before the Nara period, and it was not until a permanent government was established at Nara that literature and the arts began to really flourish. This is scarcely the place to trace the history of Japanese literature, but to fully understand these incredible diaries of court ladies of old Japan, it is necessary to know a little of the world they lived in, to be able to feel their atmosphere and recognize their allusions. We know a good deal about Japan today, but the Japan with which we are familiar only slightly resembles that of the diaries. Centuries of feudalism have come between. We must go behind all this and begin again. We have all heard of the 47 Ronins and the No drama, of shoguns, daimyos, and samurais, and many of us live in daily communion with Japanese prints. It gives us pause to reflect that the earliest of these things is almost as many centuries ahead of the ladies as it is behind us. Shogun means general, and of course there were always generals, but the power of the shoguns and the military feudalism of which the daimyos and their attendant samurais were a part did not really begin until the middle of the 12th century, and did not reach its full development until the middle of the 14th. The No drama started with the ancient religious pantomimic dance, the kagura, but not until words were added in the 14th century did it become the No. And block color printing was first practiced in 1695, while such famous print artists as Utamaro, Hokusai, and Hiroshige are all products of the 18th or early 19th centuries. To find the ladies behind the military ages, we must go back a long way and so gain a sort of perspective. Chinese literature and civilization were introduced into Japan somewhere between 270 and 310 AD, and Buddhism followed in 552. Chinese influence and Buddhism are 2 enormous facts in understanding Japan. To be sure, Shintoism was never displaced by Buddhism, but the latter made a tremendous appeal to the Japanese, as the diaries show. In fact, it was not until the Meiji period, 1867 to 1912, that Shintoism was again made the state religion. With the introduction of Chinese civilization came the art of writing, and printing from movable blocks followed from Korea in the 8th century. Chinese came to be considered the language of learning. Japanese scholars wrote in Chinese. All the serious books, think history, theology, science, law, were written in Chinese. But in 712, a volume called Records of Ancient Matters was compiled in Japanese. It is the earliest book in Japanese now extant. If the scholars wrote in a borrowed language, the poets knew better. They wrote in their own, and the poetry of the Nara period has been preserved for us in an anthology, the Manyoshu, or Collection of 1,000 Leaves. This was followed at the beginning of the 10th century by the Kokinshu, or Ancient and Modern Poems, to which, however, the editor, Tsurayuki, felt obliged to write a Chinese preface. The ladies of the Diaries were extremely familiar with these volumes. Their own writings are full of allusions to poems contained in them. Sei Shonagon, writing early in the 11th century, describes a young lady's education as consisting of writing, music, and the 20 volumes of the Kokinshu. So it came about that while learned gentlemen still continued to write in Chinese, poetry, fiction, diaries, and desultory essays called zuihitsu, or following the pen, were written in Japanese. Now, the position of women at this time was very different from what it afterwards became in the feudal period. The Chinese called Japan the Queen Country because of the ascendancy which women enjoyed there. They were educated, they were allowed a share of inheritance, they had their own houses. It is an extraordinary and important fact that much of the best literature of Japan has been written by women. 3 of these most remarkable women are the authors of these diaries. A 4th to be named with them, Sei Shonagon, to whom I have just referred, was a contemporary. In 794, the capital was moved from Nara to Kyoto, which was given the name of Heianjo, or City of Peace, and with the removal, a new period, the Heian, began. It lasted until 1186, and our ladies lived in the very middle of it. By this time, Japan was its own thriving civilization, with much fine and delicate. At least, this is true of all that life which centered round the court at Kyoto. To historians, the Heian period represents the rise and fall of the Fujiwara family. This powerful family had served the Mikados from time out of mind as heads of the Shinto priests, and after the middle of the 7th century, they became ministers or prime ministers. An immense clan, they gradually absorbed all the civil offices in the kingdom, while the military offices were filled by the Taira and Minamoto families. It was the rise of these last, as the Fujiwara declined, which eventually led to the rule of the Shoguns and the long centuries of feudalism and civil war. But in the middle of the Heian period, the Fujiwara were very much everywhere. Most of the court ladies who were authors of remarkable books were the daughters of governors of provinces, and that meant Fujiwaras to a greater or lesser degree. At that time, polygamy flourished in Japan, and the family had grown to a prodigious size. Since a civil office meant a post for a Fujiwara, many of them were happily provided for. But they were so numerous that they outnumbered the legitimate positions, and others had to be created to fill the demand. The court was full of persons of both sexes holding sinecures, with a great deal of time on their hands and nothing to do in it but write poetry, which they did exceedingly well, and attend the various functions prescribed by etiquette. Ceremonials were many and magnificent, and poetry writing became, not only a game, but a natural adjunct to every possible event. The Japanese, as a nation, are dowered with a rare and exquisite taste, and in the Heian period, taste was cultivated to an amazing degree. Murasaki Shikibu records the astounding pitch to which it had reached in a passage in her diary. Speaking of the Mikado's ladies at a court festivity, she says of the dress of one of them, when she went before the royal presence to fetch something, the nobles and high officials noticed it. Afterwards, Lady Saisho regretted it deeply. It was not so bad. Only one color was a little too pale. That passage needs no comment. It is completely illuminating. It is a paraphrase of the whole era. Kyoto was a little city, long one way by some 17,000 odd feet, or about 3 1/3 miles, wide the other by 15,000, or approximately another 3 miles. The palace was built in the Azumaya style, a form of architecture which was also followed in noblemen's houses. The roof, or rather roofs, for there were many buildings, was covered with bark, and inside the divisions into rooms were made by different sorts of moving screens. At the period of the Diaries, the reigning Mikado, Ichijo, had 2 wives. Sadako, the first queen, was the daughter of a previous prime minister, Michitaka, of Fujiwara, of course. The other, Akiko, daughter of Michinaga, the prime minister of the Diaries and a younger brother of Michitaka, was second queen, or Chugu. These queens each occupied a separate house in the palace. Kokiden was the name of Queen Sadako's house. Fujitsubu, the name of Queen Akiko's. The rivalry between these ladies was naturally great, and extended even to their entourage. Each strove to surround herself with ladies who were not only beautiful, but learned. The bright star of Queen Sadako's court was Sei Shonagon, the author of a remarkable book, the Makura no Soshi, or Pillow Sketches, while Murasaki Shikibu held the same exalted position in Queen Akiko's. We are to imagine a court founded upon the Chinese model, but not so elaborate, a brilliant assemblage of persons, all playing about a restricted but very bright center. From it, the high officials went out to be governors of distant provinces, and the lesser ones followed them to minor posts. But in spite of the distinction of such positions, distance and the inconvenience of traveling made the going a sort of laureled banishment. These gentlemen left Kyoto with regret and returned with satisfaction. But the going, and the years of residence away, was one of the commonplaces of social life. Fujiwara though one might be, one often had to wait and scheme for an office, and the diaries contain more than one reference to such waiting and the bitter disappointment when the office was not up to expectation. These functionaries traveled with a large train of soldiers and servants, but with the best will in the world, these last could not make the journeys other than tedious and uncomfortable. Still, there were alleviations. The scenery was often beautiful, and whether the traveler were the governor himself or his daughter, he noted and delighted in it. The Sarashina diary is full of this appreciation of nature. We are told of a very beautiful beach with long drawn white waves, of a torrent whose water was white as if thickened with rice flour. We need only think of the prints with which we are familiar to be convinced of the accuracy of this picture. The waves of the outer sea were very high, and we could see them through the pine trees which grew scattered over the sandy point which stretched between us and the sea. They seemed to strike across the ends of the pine branches and shone like jewels. The diarist goes on to remark that it was an interesting night. which we can very well believe, since certainly she makes us long to see it. These journeys are mostly made on horseback, but there were other methods of progression which, however, were probably not always feasible for long distances. The nobles used various kinds of carriages drawn by one bullock, and there were also palanquins carried by bearers. It was not only the officials who made journeys. All the world made them to temples and shrines for the good of their souls. There are religious yearnings in all the diaries, and many mikados and gentlemen entered the priesthood, Michinaga among them. Sutra recitation and incantation were ceaselessly performed at court. We can gain some idea of the almost fanatical hold which Buddhism had over the educated mind by the fact that the Fujiwara family built such great temples as Gokurakuji, Hosohoji, Hokoin, Jomyoji, Murojuin, etc. It is recorded that Mikado Shirakawa, at a date somewhat subsequent to the diaries, made pilgrimages 4 times to Kumano, and during his visits there worshipped 5,470 painted Buddhas, 127 carved Buddhas, 16 feet high, 3,150 Buddhas life-sized, 2,930 carved Buddhas shorter than 3 feet, 21 pagodas, and 446,630 miniature pagodas. A busy man, truly. But the record does not mention what became of the affairs of state meanwhile. That this worship was by no means lip devotion merely, any reader of the Sarashina diary can see that it was mixed with much superstition, and a profound belief is also abundantly evident. But let us for a moment recollect the time. It will place the marvel of this old, careful civilization before us as nothing else can. To be sure, Greece and Rome had been, but they had passed away, or at least their greatness had, gone and apparently left no trace. While these Japanese ladies were writing, Europe was in the full blackness of her darkest ages. Germany was founding the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, characteristically founding it with the mailed fist. Moorish civilization was at its height in Spain. Robert Capet was king of poor famine-scourged France. Ethelred the Unready. That's a name someone gave up. Can you imagine being coronated and the entire nation is like, ah, yeah, that's Ethelred the Unready. Oh my gosh. Okay, gotta focus here. Ethelred the Unready was ruling in England and doing his best to keep off the Danes by payment and massacre. Later, while the Sarashina diary was being written, King Canute was sitting in his armchair and giving orders to the sea. Curious, curious world, so far apart from the one of the diaries. And to think that even 500 years later, Columbus was sending letters into the interior of Cuba addressed to the Emperor of Japan. These diaries show us a world extraordinarily like our own, if very unlike it in more than one important particular. The noble men and women of Mikado Ichijo's court were poets and writers of genius. Their taste as a whole has never been surpassed by any people at any time, but their scientific knowledge was elementary. Diseases and conflagrations were frequent. In the space of 51 years, the royal palace burnt down 11 times. During the same period, there were 4 great pestilences, a terrible drought, and an earthquake. Robbers infested many parts of the country and were a constant fear to travelers and pilgrims. Childbirth was very dangerous. The picture of the birth of a child to Queen Akiko, with which Murasaki Shikibu's diary begins, shows us all its bitter horror. From page to page we share the writer's suspense, and with our greater knowledge, it is with a sense of wonder that we watch the queen's return to hell. But after all, Diseases and conflagrations are seldom more than episodes in a normal life, lived under sane conditions. And it is just because these diaries reflect the real life of these three ladies that they are important. The world they portray is quite as advanced as our own, and in some ways, much more so. Rice was the staple of food, and although Buddhistic sentiment seldom permitted people to eat the flesh of animals, they had an abundance of fish, which was eaten boiled, baked, raw, and pickled, and a quantity of fruits and nuts. There was no sugar, but cakes were made of fruit and nuts, and there was always rice wine or sake. Gentlefolk usually dressed in silk. They wore many layers of colored garments and delighted in the harmony produced by the color combinations of silk over silk, or of a bright lining subdued by the tone of an outer robe. The ladies all painted their faces, and the whole toilet was a matter of sufficient moment to raise it into a fine art. Many of these lovely dresses are described by Murasaki Shikibu. For instance, the beautiful shape of their hair, tied with bands, was like that of the beauties in Chinese pictures. Lady Saemon held the king's sword. She wore a blue-green patternless karaginu and shaded train, with floating bands and belt of floating thread, brocade dyed in dull red. Her outer robe was trimmed with 5 folds and was chrysanthemum colored. The glossy silk was of crimson. Her figure and movement, when we caught a glimpse of it, was flower-like and dignified. Lady Ben no Naishi held the box of the king's seals. Her uchigi was grape-colored. She is a very small and smile-giving person, and seemed shy, and I was sorry for her. Her hairbands were blue-green. Her appearance suggested one of the ancient dream maidens, descended from heaven. A little later she tells us that the beaten stuffs were like the mingling of dark and light maple leaves in autumn. And, describing in some detail the festivity at which ladies appeared, she makes the comment that only the right bodyguard wore clothes of shrimp pink. To one in love with color, these passages leave a very nostalgia for the bright and sophisticated court where such things could be. And everywhere, there is poetry. A gentleman hands a lady a poem on the end of his fan, and she is expected to reply in kind within the instant. Poems form an important part of the ritual of betrothal. A daughter of a good family never allowed herself to be seen by men, a custom which appears to have admitted many exceptions. A man would write a poetical love letter to the lady of his choice, which she must answer amiably, even should she have no mind to him. If, however, she were happily inclined, he would visit her secretly at night and leave before daybreak. Would he now? He would then write again, following which she would give him a banquet and introduce him to her family. After this, he could visit her openly, although she would still remain for some time in her father's house. This custom of love letter writing and visiting is shown in Izumi Shikibu's diary. Obviously, the poems were short, and here, in order to understand those in the text, it may be well to consider for a moment what Japanese poetry consists of. Japanese is a syllabic language like our own, but unlike our own, it is not accented. Also, every syllable ends with a vowel, the consequence being that there are only 5 rhymes in the whole language. Since the employment of so restricted a rhyme scheme would be unbearably monotonous, the Japanese hit upon the happy idea of counting syllables. Our metric verse also counts syllables, but we combine them into different kinds of accented feet. Without accent, this was not possible, so the Japanese poet limits their numbers and uses them in a pattern of alternating lines. His prosody is based upon the numbers 5 and 7, and a 5-syllable line alternating with one of 7 syllables with in some forms 2 7-syllable lines together at the end of a period. The favorite form, the Tanka, is 31 syllables and runs 5-7, 5-7-7. There is a longer form, the Nagauta, but it has never been held in as high favor. The poems in the diaries are all tankas in the original. It can be seen that much cannot be said in so confined a medium, but much can be suggested. And it is just in this art of suggestion that the Japanese excel. The hokku is an even briefer form. In it, the concluding hemistich of the tanka is left off, and it is just in his hemistich that the meaning of the poem is brought out, so that the hokku is a mere essence, a whiff of an idea to be created in full by the hearer. But the hokku was not invented until the 15th century. Before that, the tanka, in spite of occasional attempts to vary it by adding more lines, changing their order, using the pattern in combination as a series of stanzas, etc., reigned practically supreme. And it is still the chief classic form for all Japanese poetry. Having briefly washed in the background of the diaries, we must notice for a moment the 3 remarkable ladies who are in the foreground. Murasaki Shikibu was the daughter of Fujiwara Tametoki, a scion of a junior branch of the famous family. She was born in 978. Murasaki was not her real name, which was apparently To Shikibu. Shikibu is a title, derived from that of her father. There are 2 legends about the reason for her receiving the name Murasaki. One is that she was given it in a playful allusion to her own heroine in the Genji Monogatari, who was called Murasaki. The other legend is more charming. It seems that her mother was one of the nurses of Mikado Ichijo, who was so fond of her that he gave her daughter this name in reference to a well-known poem. And that poem is, "When the purple grass, Murasaki, is in full color, one can scarcely perceive the other plants in the field." From the Murasaki grass, the word has come to mean a color which includes all the shades of purple, violet, and lavender. In 996, or thereabouts, she accompanied her father to the province of Echizen, of which he had become governor. A year later, she returned to Kyoto, and within a 12-month, married another Fujiwara, Nobutaka. The marriage seems to have been most happy, to judge from the constant expressions of grief in her diary for her husband's death, which occurred in 1001, a year in which Japan suffered from a great pestilence. A daughter was born to them in 1000. From her husband's death until 1005, she seems to have lived in the country, but in this year she joined the court as one of Queen Akiko's ladies. Before that, however, she had made herself famous not only for her own time, but for all time by writing the first realistic novel of Japan. This book is the Genji Monogatari, or Tale of Genji. Hitherto, Japanese authors had confined themselves to stories of no great length, and which relied, for their interest, on a fairy or wonder element. The Genji Monogatari struck out an entirely new direction. It depicted real life in Kyoto as a contemporary gentleman might have lived it. It founded its interest on the fact that people like to read about themselves. But this, which seems to us a commonplace, was an innovation when Murasaki Shikibu attempted it. It was, in fact, the flash from a mind of genius. The book follows the life of Prince Genji from his birth to his death at the age of 51, and the concluding books of the series pursue the career of one of his sons. It is an enormous work, comprising no less than 54 books and running to over 4,000 pages. The genealogical tree of the personages alone is 80 pages long. But No reader of the diary will need to be convinced that the Genji is not merely sprightly and captivating, but powerful as well. The lady was shrewd, and if she were also kindly and very attractive, nevertheless, she saw with an uncompromising eye. Her critical faculty never sleeps and takes in the minutest detail of anything she sees, noting unerringly every little rightness and wrongness connected with it. She watches the approach of Mikado and touches the matter so that we get its exact shade. When the royal palanquin drew near, the bearers, though they were rather honorable persons, bent their heads in absolute humility as they ascended the steps. Even in the highest society there are grades of courtesy, but these men were too humble. No one with such a gift can fail to be lonely, and Murasaki Shikibu seems very lonely. But it is not the passionate rebellion of Izumi Shikibu, nor the abiding melancholy of the author of the Sarashina diary. Rather, it is the disillusion of one who has seen much of the world and knows how little companionship she may expect ever to find. It is useless to talk with those who do not understand one, and troublesome to talk with those who criticize from a feeling of superiority. Especially one-sided persons are troublesome. Few are accomplished in many arts, and most cling narrowly to their own opinion. I have already shown Murasaki Shikibu's beautiful taste in dress, and indeed it is in everything, when she says, "The garden on a moonlit night was admirable." We know that it must have been of an extraordinary perfection. The diary proves her dramatic sense, as the Genji would also do could it find so sympathetic a translator. No wonder then that it leapt into instant fame. There is a pretty legend of her writing the book at the temple of Ishiyama, at the southern end of Lake Biwa. The tale gains verisimilitude in the eyes of visitors by the fact that they are shown the chamber in the temple in which she wrote and the ink slab she used. But alas, it is not true. We do not know where she wrote, nor even exactly when. The Genji is supposed to have been begun in 1002, and most commentators believe it to have been finished in 1004. That she should have been called to court in the following year seems extremely natural. Queen Akiko must have counted herself most fortunate in having among her ladies so famous a person. The diary tells the rest, the diary which was begun in 1007. We know no more of Murasaki Shikibu except that no shade of scandal ever touched her name. One of the strangest and most interesting things about the diaries is that their authors were such very different kinds of people. Izumi Shikibu is as unlike Murasaki Shikibu as could well happen, as different as the most celebrated poet of her time is likely to be from the most celebrated novelist. For Izumi Shikibu is the greatest woman poet which Japan has had. The author of 7 volumes of poems, this diary is the only prose writing of hers which is known. It is an intimate account of a love affair which seems to have been more than usually passionate and pathetic. Passionate, provocative, enchanting, it is evident that Izumi Shikibu could never have been the discriminating observer, the critic of manners, which Murasaki Shikibu became. Life was powerless to mellow so vivid a personality, but neither could it subdue it. She gives us no suggestion of resignation. She lived intensely, as her diary shows. She always had done so, and doubtless she always did. We see her as untamable, a genius compelled to follow her inclinations. Difficult to deal with, maybe, like a strong wine, but wonderfully stimulating. Izumi Shikibu was born in 974. She was the eldest daughter of Oe Masamune, another governor of Echizen. In 995, she married Tachibana Michisawa, governor of Izumi, hence her name. From this gentleman she was divorced, but just when we do not know, and he died shortly after, probably during the great pestilence which played such havoc throughout Japan, and in which Murasaki Shikibu's husband had also died. Her daughter, who followed in her mother's footsteps as a poet, had been born in 997. But Izumi Shikibu was too fascinating and too petulant to nurse her disappointment in chaste seclusion. She became the mistress of Prince Tametaka, who also died in 1002. It is very soon after this event that the diary begins. Her new lover was Prince Atsumichi, and the diary seems to have been written solely to appease her mind and to record the poems which passed between them and which Izumi Shikibu evidently regarded as the very essence of their souls. In the beginning, the affair was carried on with the utmost secrecy, but clandestine meetings could not satisfy the lovers, and at last the prince persuaded her to take up residence in the South Palace as one of his ladies. Considering the manners of the time, it is a little puzzling to see why there should have been such an outcry at this, but outcry there certainly was. The princess took violent umbrage at the prince's proceeding, and left the palace on a long visit to her relations. So violent grew the protestations of the court that in 1004 Izumi Shikibu left the palace and separated herself entirely from the prince. It was probably to emphasize the definiteness of the separation that immediately after her departure she married Fujiwara Yasumasa, governor of Tango, and left with him for that province in 1005. The facts bear out this supposition, but we do not know it from her own lips, as the diary breaks off soon after she reaches the South Palace. In 1008 she was summoned back to Kyoto to serve the queen, in the same court where Murasaki Shikibu had been since 1005. Whatever effect the scandal may have had 4 years earlier, her receiving the post of lady-in-waiting proves it to have been worth forgetting in view of her fame. And Queen Akiko must have rejoiced to add this celebrated poet to her already remarkable bevy of ladies. Of course, there was jealousy. Who can doubt it? No reader of the diaries can imagine that Izumi Shikibu and Murasaki Shikibu can have been sympathetic. And we must take with a grain of salt the latter's caustic comment, Lady Izumi Shikibu corresponds charmingly, but her behavior is improper indeed. She writes with grace and ease and a flashing wit. There is a fragrance even in her smallest words. Her poems are attractive, but they are only improvisations which drop from her mouth spontaneously. Every one of them has some interesting point, and she is acquainted with ancient literature also, but she is not like a true artist who is filled with the genuine spirit of poetry. Yet I think even she cannot presume to pass judgment on the poems of others. Is it possible that Izumi Shikibu had been so rash as to pass judgment on some of Murasaki Shikibu's efforts? Of course, it is beyond the power of any translation to preserve the full effect of the original, but even in translation, Izumi Shikibu's poems are singularly beautiful and appealing. In her own country, they are considered never to have been excelled in freshness and freedom of expression. There is something infinitely sad in this, which she is said to have written on her deathbed, as the end of a passionate life. Out of the dark, into a dark path I now must enter. Shine on me from afar, moon of the mountain fringe. In Japanese poetry, Amita Buddha is often compared to the moon, which rises over the mountains and lights the traveler's path. Very different again is the lady who wrote the Sarashina diary, and it is a very different kind of record. Murasaki Shikibu's diary is concerned with a few years of her life, Izumi Shikibu's with only one episode of hers, but the Sarashina diary covers a long period in the life of its author. The first part was written when she was 12 years old, the last entry was made when she was past 50. It begins with a journey from Shimosa to Kyoto by the Tokaido in 1021, which is followed by a second journey, some years later, from Kyoto to Sarashina. a place which has never been satisfactorily identified, although some critics have supposed it to have been the province of Shinano. The rest of the diary consists of jottings at various times, accounts of books read, of places seen, of pilgrimages to temples, of records of dreams and portents, of communings with herself on life and death, of expressions of resignation and sorrow. The book takes its name from the second of the journeys, Sarashina Nikki, meaning simply Sarashina Diary. For, strangely enough, we do not know the author's name. We do know, however, that she was the daughter of Fujiwara Takasue, and that she was born in 1009. In 1017, Takasue was appointed governor of a province, and went with his daughter to the new post. It is the return journey, made in 1021, with which the diary opens. Takasue's daughter shared with so many of her contemporaries the deep love of nature and the power to express this love in words. I have already quoted one or two of her entries on this journey. We follow the little company over mountains and across rivers. We camp with them by night and tremble as they trembled, lest robbers should attack them. We see what the little girl saw. The mountain range called Nishitomi is like folding screens with good pictures. Or, people say that purple grass grows in the fields of Mushashi, but it is only a waste of various kinds of reeds which grow so high that we cannot see the bows of our horsemen who are forcing their way through the tall grass. And share her disappointment when she says, "We passed a place called 8 Bridges, but it was only a name, no bridge, and no pretty sight." They reach Kyoto, and a rather dull life begins, enlivened only by the avid reading of romances, among them the Genji Monogatari. Then her sister dies, giving birth to a child, and the life becomes not only dull, but sorrowful. After a time, the lady obtains a position at court, but neither her bringing up nor her disposition had suited her for such a place. She mentions that mother was a person of extremely antiquated mind, and it is evident that she had been taught to look inward rather than outward. An abortive little love affair livens her dreariness for a moment. Life had dealt hardly with the sensitive girl. From year to year she grows more wistful, but suddenly something happens. A mere hint of a gleam, but opening a possibility of brightness. Who he was, we do not know, but she met him on an evening when there was no starlight, and a gentle shower fell in the darkness. They talked and exchanged poems, but she did not meet him again until the next year. Then, after an evening entertainment to which she had not gone, when I looked out, opening the sliding door to the corridor, I saw the morning moon very faint and beautiful, and he was there. Again they exchanged poems, and she believed that happiness had at last arrived. He was to come with his lute and sing to her. "I want to hear it," she writes, and waited for the fit occasion. But there was none, ever. A year later she has lost hope. She writes a poem and adds, "So I composed that poem, and there is nothing more to tell." Nothing more indeed, but what is told conveys all the misery of her deceived longing. The last part of the diary is concerned chiefly with accounts of pilgrimages and dreams. She married, who and when is not recorded, and bore children. Her husband dies, and with his death the spring of her life seems to have run down. Her last entry is very sad. "Many people went to live elsewhere, and I lived alone in my solitary home. So we leave her, a beautiful, shy spirit whose life had known much sorrow." Well, that was a note to end on, but I'm afraid it's where we're stopping for today. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm excited to get into the first of the 3 diaries, Lady Sarashina. Let's see what story she has for us next week.